Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, the complete nobody. This is episode 142. Wow, that's crazy. And on this week's episode, I will be reviewing the newest Marvel Cinematic Universe film, Thunderbolts. There will be a non-spoiler section of the review as well as a spoiler section. So if you've seen the movie, or if you have, you can choose which section of the review you want to listen to. Time codes for that will be in the episode description, and then I will be reacting to listener mail and answers to the question of the week. Let's jump into Thunderbolts.
There's something wrong with me. An emptiness. I thought it started when my sister died, but now it feels like something bigger. Just a void.
Thunderbolts, believe it or not, is the 36th film in the MCU, and it's really interesting looking at where we are. Obviously, there has been a lot of frustration with the MCU after Endgame, a lot of inconsistency, and the bar that had been set prior to the Infinity Saga concluding was much higher. What I find particularly interesting is Captain America Brave New World and Thunderbolts are both trying to do the same thing. Talking about Captain America Brave New World with Kofi was, it is a sequel to a bunch of different plot and story threads left over in the MCU. Obviously going all the way back to Incredible Hulk, and then Eternals, continuing the story from Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Thunderbolts is quite similar, where we have the continuation of Yelena Belova's character off of her appearance in Hawkeye, and then we get characters from mostly Black Widow, that being obviously Yelena Belova, but Red Guardian, as well as Taskmaster, and then a continuation of two of our leads from Falcon and the Winter Soldier, of course, Bucky Barnes, continuing from his brief cameo in Captain America Brave New World, and then John Walker, who became U.S. agent at the end of that show, when it was then changed to also be titled Captain America and the Winter Soldier. You're just going to have to watch the show to understand where I'm coming from. But the distinction is, to me, not going, all of you have loose threads and we need to wrap all these things together in a not cohesive film. And I, of course, did review the film. You can check out that episode. What I loved so much about Thunderbolts, and a question I've been asked quite frequently, is this just Marvel's Suicide Squad? And one of the major factors for me in addressing the two of those, and there are multiple different teams of heroes or anti-heroes or villains. The Suicide Squad, which is DC's version of anti-heroes or villain, they're just villains, honestly, because they're coming out of Bel Rev. They don't have a choice in what they're doing. They have a bomb in their neck, as we've seen in 2 feature films now. If they choose to not do what they're supposed to or what they've been ordered to do, they die. A lot of what makes heroes, specifically in pop culture, is people choosing to do the right thing because they know it is the right thing to do. You can argue Suicide Squads have concluded with the heroes coming to that realization, but that's not the point of those stories. What I like so much about Thunderbolts, it is approaching 5 to 6, 7, if you include everybody and some other characters that I can get into in spoilers. They're all broken people, and this movie has something to say. I had a lot of friends asking about what I thought about the movie, and it reminded me substantially about where Pixar was, specifically in the 2010s. We were given a lot of sequels in that time period. We had Toy Story 3, Cars 2, Brave, a prequel with Monsters University, and then continued to get even more sequels after that. But Inside Out was a key original film in a run of about 5 movies that clearly had something to say and addressed mental health for children. Obviously, it's become universal, and one of the major successes of Pixar films is that they are universal. They have really deep and interesting concepts, but it still accessible by children. Thunderbolts continues a intro into the discussions of mental health. I was lucky enough to participate in a virtual press conference for the film about a week ago by the time you're listening to this. And it was really interesting to see how each of the cast members addressed their own ideas of their mental health and how it allowed them to access their characters in the movie, and particularly the relationships that the characters have. And the fact that this movie had the focus, the maturity, and the levity to approach these things while still managing to deliver an entertaining film is what makes this movie stand on top of many other films we've had so far in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A while back, I did a tier list of where we are right now in Phase 5 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's not necessarily been great. I have 3 things to put on there now. I have to add Captain America, Brave New World, I have to add Daredevil, Born Again, and I have to add Thunderbolts. And I'll do that when the review is over, and eventually you'll probably see a little video of me saying where I think those 2 things should go. But the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been in a messy situation. A lot of people have argued that we are in the worst days of it ever. And while it's been such a conversation, I know I had it with my friends over at Comic Book Nation and with Kofi discussing Captain America as well as Daredevil Born Again, this idea that Marvel is back with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which is one of my favorite Marvel films, particularly in Phase 5, and then a lot of inconsistency. I would argue more so on the television front, but with the release of Deadpool and Wolverine, which obviously was a smash success, and then Captain America Brave New World failing to gross what was likely expected. It only made about $414 million, but the movie didn't manage to reach the heights, I believe, of the expectation of that film, particularly coming off of the back of what was a wildly successful Captain America trilogy. And connecting stuff to the streaming TV shows for Marvel has been kind of a mess, where you have a lot of people who are not necessarily invested. And what works so much about Thunderbolts is, while a lot of these are established characters, the movie is addressing them at where they are now. A lot of their history doesn't need to be relevant. It, of course, adds layers of understanding, but it is addressed in the film that I personally think would allow a lot of new viewers into watching the movie, where, of course, we are expecting this to be a success. It is a Marvel movie, and that expectation is important, but specifically looking at where we are left in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we don't have a lot of films before the multiverse saga comes to an end. We have Fantastic Four, we have Avengers Doomsday, and then we have Spider-Man Brand New Day, and then we have Avengers Secret Wars. We have 4 films before this version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe arguably will never be the same again. And I don't say that lightly. I think that's really interesting. And Thunderbolts does not lack the stakes of what we expect from a Marvel Cinematic Universe film. There are high stakes, but what sets this apart, but also, as I said in my review that went out on Tuesday after the press screenings were allowed to give our reviews, which is, this is a very unique Marvel movie, unlike anything we've seen before from them. But what makes this movie special is everybody involved clearly knew what they wanted to do with this story, and the characters of the Marvel Cinematic Universe are what we were invested in. Tony Stark's snap at the end of Endgame doesn't matter if we don't love Tony Stark. And because of that, there has been a separation in the expectation of what works with these movies. And argue that or not, I think it's unfortunate that there are films that people may or may not have been readily waiting to not enjoy. Marvel putting the focus back on the characters' relationships and why they matter to the story, giving us compelling arcs. And regardless of this being an ensemble film, there is a focus on probably 2 to 3 of the characters, that being Florence Pugh's Yelena Belova, David Harbour's Alexei, what is his last name? I actually don't think I remember what it is. what is it? Where is your last name? Why can't I see it? Shostakov, and then Lewis Pullman's Bob. They're the three that really are at the center of the movie, and all of those relationships need to work. More specifically, looking at the ever-evolving dynamic between Red Guardian and Yelena's. She's not technically a Black Widow. She eventually becomes the White Widow, in the comics, to my knowledge, but I'm not going to make an assessment based on where she is in the film. And the back and forth with their relationships with the Red Room, obviously that now being defunct after the events of Black Widow, it probably being the movie you definitely have to see before watching this, and it adds certainly a lot more of understanding of those relationships. But putting them in the instance now where we finally really feel like, outside of Spider-Man, who's had 2 movies post-Endgame, really getting to see the aftermath of some of these events, really affecting the characters on an emotional level. What has the casualties of that event mattered, or how has it affected these people? And why the Marvel Cinematic Universe worked again is its brilliance in casting. Florence Pugh specifically in this movie is absolutely incredible. She's a phenomenal actress. I reviewed We Live in Time in the fall, which she was obviously brilliant in, and she continues to have an incredible filmography. But similar to a lot of other movies, what works well besides the drama is that balance of comedy. And David Harbour, I think, really finds what works best with Red Guardian in this movie more so than in Black Widow. I did like him in that movie, but this version of that character really does have an understanding of his role in Yelena's life. He understands where she's coming from, the relationship that she had with Natasha, and wanting to be the best quote-unquote dad he can be for her. And the through line with the movie being the two of them and how they're back and forth really does set the stakes for the conclusion of the movie. Doesn't work if those two actors aren't as brilliant as they are. In terms of an actual ensemble, because that is important, this is a team movie, everybody bounces off each other really funnily. Is that a word? I don't know. Funnily? I don't know if it is a word. Let's look up if that's a word. Funnily, yes it is. Funnily enough is what I meant to say. Where we get these characters at really interesting places. We've seen in clips that Ava the Ghost, as well as John Walker, U.S. agent, and Florence Pugh's Yelena Belova are all working for Allegra de Fontaine, Julia Louis-Dreyfus's character, and it's essentially a mission that unites all of them and their discovery of Bob. And all these characters bouncing off each other. Again, we've seen a bunch of different team movies in the MCU. And what sets these people apart from, let's say, the Guardians of the Galaxy is most of those characters are in with Guardians of the Galaxy are in it because of so completely selfish things that they are looking for. And as a result, they realize they have a shared goal in mind, particularly in the first film. And then they build a sort of surrogate family near the end of it, where Thunderbolts is really interesting because you get these characters all at the worst phase of their current life. Everybody is very unhappy. And it's through their conversations that they realize, like, this is not the way that I saw things going when I signed up to be working for the director of the CIA. And it's in the culminating event of the beginning of the movie that brings them all together, that gives them their shared mission. And throughout the movie, we start to see that they're understanding each other much more than the surface level dynamics that are established in the beginning when they're all trying to kill each other. That is to say, again, Marvel movies particularly are always a three-headed hydra because there's the comedy that needs to work, there's the drama that needs to work, and there's the action that needs to work. And it's funny enough, I was watching an interview with Ben Wong, who's going to be in the new Karate Kid Legends, and he talked about musicals and action films need to use the musicality and the singing and dancing the same way that action films need to use the action, which is to progress the story. And Thunderbolts has some really fun, interesting action sequences that feel reminiscent of some things we've seen before, but also remind us why we love these characters. That you can have humor and badass moments webbed perfectly through those action sequences to establish character. Particularly in one of the trailers, we see Bucky Barnes' Terminator 2 moment, and it's absolutely spectacular. Sebastian Stan is one of those people that I would be shocked if every time he does a movie outside of the MCU, that Marvel Studios is just rubbing their hands together, because he's proving, as the years have gone on, him being in the MCU now for 14 years, what an incredible actor he is, and he just gets better with each performance. And where he is amongst the other Thunderbolts is such a different place than they are, where the way that he fills in his role with the Thunderbolts, I was so happy to see. I think this is the Marvel movie. If I was going to suggest anything out of Phase 5, you can't miss. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is interesting because it's the conclusion, and Deadpool and Wolverine, as much as I liked it, is a movie that requires, shockingly, an incredible amount of prior knowledge to seeing, and Thunderbolts manages to be a Marvel movie that you will love because it does so many of the things we love from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but its key focus on what it wanted to say and address with the story being told sets it apart from so many of the other films, and I really enjoyed it, and I can tell you even more in spoilers. So let's jump into spoilers for Thunderbolts.
This ends today.
Congressman Barnes, wow. You know, I never really thought you'd have a promising political career, but less than half a term. Yikes.
We're taking you in, Val.
I don't think so. Junior varsity, Captain America.
Now we're in full spoilers, and I can tell you
What happened?
what happened in the movie, and it's really interesting, and the reason I brought up Inside Out, if you're unaware, is because the movie puts a significant focus, and you can argue is the whole point of the movie, its analysis of mental health and the effect it has had on all of our anti-heroes and heroes, where the lead of the movie is Yelena Belova. She's dealing with a substantial amount of depression outside of what has happened in Endgame, the death of Natasha, being reunited with her for the moment of Black Widow, only for her to die during the Avengers Endgame culmination of the Infinity Saga. And she is just working for Valentina, doing mission after mission after mission, which results in Valentina setting up all of her agents to then go to a secret facility where, and this was one thing that bothered me actually in terms of continuity for the movie, not in terms of a mistake, but I saw the movie twice. I got to go to my screening and then I saw it with Chris, where they kept saying the Ox Group, and the first time I heard that, I thought they said Oxcorp or Oscorp, and I got very excited. Of course they didn't. It was Ox Group, which is the shadow organization that Valentina had been working with to do all sorts of illegal experiments, this being why Bob is in the story. Bob being one of the least best kept secrets of the entire movie. But what I really appreciate about what they did with the marketing for him is they actually, in the spoilers, we're in full spoilers, in the marketing for the movie, they're showing us the Void, which is Sentry completely devoid of light and is putting people into this void, which is the worst memories that they have, really pulling at why they are either anxious or depressed and unhappy with themselves, where we don't actually get to see Sentry in the marketing, which is really, really funny, assuming people know who Sentry is, but not who the Void is. But they are all sent to this secret base because Valentina wants them all to kill themselves. And it's at this point where Yelena believes performing this last mission will then get her out and she can become more public facing. This after a conversation she has with Red Guardian about her depression. And I love the conversations, as I said in non-spoilers, that David Harbour has with Florence Pugh, him telling her about what he believes makes her such a great person and that optimism and loyalty she had as a young girl, and seeing that spark in her dwindling because of what she's gone through, and not to let her past be a reflection of who she is now. Everybody has made mistakes, and not letting those things drag you down into your darkness or into the void that you feel. And that being the focus of this is why this movie stands tall amongst some of the MCU's best. We've had a lot of great Marvel movies. I like a bunch of them post Endgame, but for a movie to have such a succinct idea of how it wanted to portray mental health and what it was going to do to not show a solution to mental health, but to show that it takes an army to deal with that in being supported and having those conversations, it can help you through quite literally the dark times. And that is such an important message, specifically to be in a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. We've had other movies that have addressed mental health. Marvel has touched on this with the post-traumatic stress that Tony is clearly dealing with in Iron Man 3. But that being a part of the story, Tony's still Tony by the end of the movie, to show where these characters are and for the conclusion of the film ultimately to be about emotional support because of people's mental health. And that's what makes Bob such an interesting character, which is Lewis Pullman's portrayal of Bob Reynolds, somebody who has had a substantially traumatic upbringing, not seeing himself as worthy, which has allowed this alternative personality to fester within him, creating the void, and his abilities that he is given through the Ox Group's Century program are only accessible when he is in touch with that dark side of him. The highs are high and the lows are lows, and feeling completely worthlessness. And the movie has quite a few instances of characters are considering suicide, which is something that clearly mental health go hand in hand, unfortunately, with deaths due to suicide. Where the choice to talk about this in not a condescending fashion, to approach it from a purely mature standpoint, I commend everybody involved, because I did not expect to see that from this. Going through all the trailers, it looks like a fun movie, and there have been people who've been complaining about Marvel movies not being just fun. No, the reason that Thunderbolts is going to stand the test of time amongst massive comic book movies is its focus. There are so many instances, even in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where it feels like any moment of seriousness is always undercut by comedy, and sometimes that's worth it, particularly if you feel completely bogged down by drama. But Thunderbolts has a balance where it's going to talk about the serious things, but it is still going to make you laugh. And that's why somebody like David Harbour is so important to a movie like this. He can have the raw emotional moments with Yelena, particularly in the climax, reminding her of who she is and who he sees, and that being the spark that unites the team to then enter the void and save Bob from himself. That's incredible, because this movie gives you the spectacle of them fighting Sentry, losing, and then still trying to save New York City, which is where the climax is. You see in the trailers that Valentina had purchased Avengers Watchtower, the Avengers Tower, it's now called Watchtower. And to have an instance where we have this ragtag group of people who don't see themselves as worthy. John Walker himself is dealing with a substantial amount of depression due to the fact that his wife and son, or wife and child, I'm not sure what the gender of the child is, have left him, and he's in the dumps because of that, as well as obviously what Ghost has been dealing with, not really being able to exist. And it's through these interactions that all of these characters have with each other that they form this team. Even after losing to Sentry, these heroes still manage to save New York from the cataclysmic damage of when Sentry becomes the Void. And it's in that brilliance where you see a new team founded. They are the Thunderbolts, asterisk. But are they really? Of course, we're in full spoilers, and I don't mind saying this because we are in the depths of full spoilers, which is after they enter the Void, save Bob from himself, and they are revealed to New York as these heroes. We know that Valentina earlier in the film is setting up a press conference to unveil Sentry to the world because she's been dealing with this impeachment trial that's been going on in the side, which is why she wanted to hide all of these illegal operations she's been involved with. but she flips it and changes the team. And a lot of people were assuming Dark Avengers. No, the Thunderbolts are then revealed to the team as the new Avengers. So our new Avengers team is the White Widow, the Winter Soldier, US Agent, Taskmaster's killed in the beginning, shocker, Bob, because he's just Bob, and then Red Guardian and Ghost. So that is the new Avengers team. We get to hear the Thunderbolts theme, which is something I really appreciated. I think Sun Locks, who I'm not familiar with, the band, creates a really interesting score that allows the quiet moments to be subtle, but at the same time, the big epic action moments still feel like they have their own flair, which is something that I greatly appreciate. So we now know why the asterisk is not going to be there. The last thing I want to talk about is the post-credits, which is we see them inside the Watchtower. Everybody has new looks, and there seems to be some issues between their team, the New Avengers, and Sam Wilson, who is founding his own Avengers team. And honestly, the second part of this post-credit scenes, I don't want to talk about because it was so awesome, and what it implies is something I've been thinking about. So all I'll say is I think it's really cool to see post-credit scenes finally mattering and connecting to where we are going, thus being there is a tease for a spaceship with the Fantastic Four, and that, of course, is leading into the next Marvel movie, which is the Fantastic Four, which comes out in July. I loved Thunderbolts. I think the story is great. It gives us everything we like from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it feels like the MCU is back in a place where people are excited for the next installment, which is not something I thought would take so long, but here we are, and I'm really excited for that. Now that I've reviewed Thunderbolts, I would love for you to comment below or at me and let me know what you thought about the movie. I'm looking forward to all of your responses at Film Realist on all the social medias. But now, let's jump into Question of the Week.
Can I ask you a question? Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's Question of the Week was, who that hasn't been announced yet for Avengers Doomsday do you expect to see? We got a bunch of different answers. Let's check them out right now. So directly on Spotify, my comments are... Here we go. Legacy Odinson said, "That's my secret, Captain. I have zero idea who has been announced for Doomsday because I avoid comic book movie marketing like the plague. I suppose Charlie Cox having a cameo would be cool. I expect the movie to largely consist of bigger players, exclusively with cameos being the exception." Stephanie writes in, "I honestly haven't been following the MCU since Endgame." Okay, so I think I'll ask you a question this week. How are you feeling about The Last of Us Season 2 so far? Are you happy with how the story is going and with some of the adjustments? I'm sure you'll do a full review when the season is over, but I'm curious what your initial impressions are. Stephanie, thank you so much for the question. I'm absolutely loving Last of Us Season 2 so far, specifically because they are changing the story and rearranging it so it works better for TV. I don't need the game to be told exactly the same. This is such a different medium, and I think for the most part, everything they've done to make the story work better for TV has worked better for TV. And that's what I think of it so far. We're 3 episodes in right now. Episode 4 will come out by the time this episode airs, but I'm loving season 2 so far. Stephanie, what are you thinking? And then we have Scotty Cameron, who writes in, "I have 2 characters, and they are Tom Holland, Spider-Man, and Benedict Cumberbatch, Doctor Strange, because the first multiverse incursion in the MCU was in Spider-Man No Way Home. That was the first time they set up the multiverse conflict, then with Multiverse of Madness. So those are 2 characters with experience within the multiverse and meeting doppelgangers. It would make sense to include them. Everyone feels like they are going to be saved for Secret Wars." That's true. And then I also had some comments on TikTok, which was awesome. We have Alex Pocket 85 said Walton Goggins. Don't know why, but he's great. And then Valerie writes in Haley Steinfeld. Interesting. There's been a lot of news about what almost happened with Hawkeye season 2, but I don't really want to get into it because that could change very quickly. And then what is Dylan Pollock's comment? Here we go. I know it's obvious the answer is Tom Holland, but he wasn't part of the announcement, right? Other than that, it seems like too many characters already. The multiverse Michael Rooker as Yondu, and I said, God, no more Rooker. All right, here we go. We've got our novel from Scotty Cameron. I enjoyed the audio novel from Kyle. I think a few things were touched there with Marvel Studios, DC, and Lucasfilm announcing so many shows and films way in advance and those things getting delayed or canceled. It kind of gets annoying because if you get really excited about one of those films announced, then it constantly delayed until the point where it either happens or is canceled. The wind in the sails or whatever project is completely wiped out. Look at The Flash. It faced constant delays and then it finally happened 9 years after it was announced and nobody cared. It's not that nobody cared, I don't think, Scotty Cameron. I think it's because it wasn't a good movie. Not even having 3 Batman in it could save it. I actually had to think about that. Yes, it does have 3 Batman. I doubt a 90-day theatrical run would have saved it. It wasn't saved by the insurance payout like Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which is why the final reckoning is still happening and wasn't canceled as a tax write-off. Mission Impossible 7's 90-day theatrical run paired with Chubb Insurance made the film break even. Back to the mainline subject, I think the studios need to understand you can't keep a hype train going indefinitely, and canceling announced projects will lead to the cynicism in the fandom. I totally agree with that. With that being said, I do also think there's large fandoms that are extremely impatient. Oh yeah, totally agree. Even without officially announcing and delaying cancellations, the fandom menace will declare a project also canceled without any official word or confirmation. If it doesn't happen immediately after the announcement, they already prematurely declared the Batman 2 canceled, despite Warner Brothers saying the opposite simply because it wasn't released yet. People need to understand that these movies do take time to make. Many directors and writers are slow when it comes to crafting a script. Matthew Reeves, by his own admission, is a slow writer, and The Penguin came out between installments, and Reeves did write and direct a few episodes of that show. Lauren LaFranc, who was the showrunner, is the co-screenwriter for The Batman Part 2, much like she was for the first film. So The Penguin needed to wrap up the work before Batman Part 2 could begin. Patience is a virtue. I think Blade is a victim of internal shakeups at Marvel Studios and restructuring. Allegedly, there was pressure to make it a multiverse film and tie in vampires to the multiverse, and that wasn't working, so it's been delayed until the multiverse saga ends. Seriously, studios, cool your jets on announcements. I read the rest of this, Scotty, and the key thing I want to touch on is a lot of these projects that you talk about in here are interesting, particularly with the different use of the Tom Clancy universe. And when it comes to Batman, honestly, it's such a hot topic that it gets exhausting to talk about. I do think Ben Affleck's Batman movie would have been really, really great, but regardless of it happening, we're getting other Batman stuff, and we will always get Batman stuff. So I'm never really going to get hung up on a Batman thing. And then I got a direct message here from Daniel Juhas, who shared a tweet with me and wanted me to talk about it. So, trigger warning. The President of the United States said the movie industry in America is dying a very fast death. Other countries are offering all sorts of incentives to draw our filmmakers and studios away from the United States. Hollywood and many other areas within the USA are being devastated. This is a concentrated effort by other nations and therefore national security threat. It is in addition to everything else, messaging and propaganda. Therefore, I am authorizing the Department of Commerce and the United States Trade Representative to immediately begin the process of instituting a 100% tariff on any and all movies coming into our country that are being produced in foreign lands. We went all movies in America again. Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for writing in. This is a really interesting conversation, and it is certainly one with a lot of depth, but particularly with the quote-unquote death of Hollywood. Last week, so that being April 25th to April 27th, I mentioned this in that episode, 4 separate movies domestically all grossed over $20 million. That's incredible, and it almost never happens. Yes, some of them were sequels, that being The Revenge of the Sith screening, The Accountant 2, and Minecraft being a obviously recognizable brand. But what's leading the charge, in fact, is new great movies. So Sinners has had an incredible 3-week release window. That being week to week, looking at domestically for the weekend, it dropped 4% from the first week and then dropped 27% to this week. But that is going from 55 million to 45 to 33. Ryan Coogler made an R-rated vampire, it's not a musical, but movie with music. And people are going in droves because the word of mouth is that important. Yes, The film industry is not in a great place when you compare it to the days of yore. But what has become abundantly clear is how much word of mouth matters, as well as new and original films. Going back a year, almost 2 years now, to Barbenheimer, which was incredible. You had 2 movies battling it out, and both of them made, I believe, $1 billion. I'd have to check Oppenheimer, but I feel like it did make $1 billion. Let me pull up that number. No, 975. So absolutely close. What's become especially important, and this has become more and more noticeable with the rise of streaming. Obviously, there was a pandemic involved, which obviously the president of the United States, who was in charge for a portion of it, would completely avoid. But that has substantially trained people to not wait for movies, as well as what used to be, I don't even want to say expected or even acceptable, but lower budget movies are now being released on streaming, where if you're already paying for those streaming packages, you're just going to watch for free. Disney is one of the services that truly has suffered from this transition and expected smaller release windows for their theatrical films. A lot of studios, unfortunately, now are reacting. If a movie doesn't have a good opening weekend, they tend to tell you when it's going to be in theaters. And because of this, some people are just waiting. I know that a lot of people are clamoring for original movies. So what I will say to you is go. And when it comes to he didn't necessarily address this in his comment, but his talking about movies being produced elsewhere, a lot of the tax incentives that used to be around in the United States are not necessarily as high as they used to be, but films are still being made in Georgia specifically. We know, being Canadian, a lot of things are shot in Toronto. If they want projects to be filmed in the United States, there needs to be incentives for those production studios to then make them in the United States. What's funny to me is Marvel, who's currently filming Avengers Doomsday, and we learned that by the time you're listening to this, production was to start a week ago during the press conference, that it's shooting in London. And some of it also has to do with for the big blockbusters, there's only so many sets. So say what you will about that, but looking at this week's opening weekend, which is when he announced this, Thunderbolts had a 76 domestic gross. In total, it was 180 worldwide, 162 worldwide, which is a good release. Sinners, I already said, is at 33. Minecraft, unfortunately, is continuing its success. It is one of the worst movies I've seen this year, if not the worst movie, and it's looking like it's going to crack $1 billion. And also, there was a somewhat reasonable drop to The Accountant 2. So there are movies to go and see. Is this the best May launch window ever? Of course not, but it'll be really interesting to see, once there's positive momentum, specifically behind Thunderbolts, what its second weekend is going to look like. So thanks so much for asking me to talk about that. Usually news is not something I address on the podcast, but Dan had a specific question he wanted. So if you have something like that, feel free to send it in. Which leads me to this week's question of the week is, what is your favorite TV show spinoff? Next week on the podcast, I'm going to be reviewing Suits LA. I love the original show, and I wanted to talk about potentially the first or only season of that show, so I'm going to be reviewing that. To let me know, you can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com. You can also comment directly below on Spotify and YouTube, and you can comment or at me on any of the social medias at filmreelist. Make sure to include the hashtag QOTW. That will do it for the show. My name is Kyle Naranya. If you haven't yet, please give the show a follow and a 5-star review on your preferred podcast form. I'll see you next time.